Yo, you cool cats and kittens. This is Cole with Teen Science Cafe. I just wanted to say a couple things before we get started. First, welcome everyone. I hope everybody has taken time over the last couple weeks to kind of pursue hobbies, just make sure you're taking care of yourself. I, for one, have taken on gardening. So I have a front garden, a back garden. I'm taking care of all the plants in the office, and I started composting. So becoming quite the little steward of the earth. Second, thank you all for joining the first virtual Teen Science Cafe. This will be the first of many. It'll occur every Thursday at 5 p.m. until June 11th. So I'll be sending the roster out over the next, probably by Monday, with at least most of the participants that we have so far. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that. And because this is a virtual and it's new for lots of us, I'm just gonna go over a couple of the features. If you have any questions, please direct them to the Q&A chat. It's at the bottom for most people of your screen. And so everybody go ahead and howl like a wolf when you found that. Just kidding, I can't really hear you, but if anybody in your house did, that is pretty dang funny. So throughout the cafe, our moderators, Nathan and Griffin, will be popping in to answer your questions. So they'll be working towards that. And then at the end, you'll be able to ask questions with the Q&A session. And for that section, you can do the raise your hand feature, which is also, it should be right next to the Q&A button. And then you can tune in with your audio. You can also just keep using that question and answer chat if you don't want to do that. So without further ado, I'll cede the screen to Griffin. He can introduce our speaker, Dr. Jaspers.
All right, hey everyone, hope everyone's doing good. Here's a quick intro for our speaker today. Dr. Jaspers is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of Pediatrics with joint appointments in the Departments of Microbiology and Immunology, as well as Environmental Sciences and Engineering. She has a long-standing interest in the adverse health effects induced by pollutant exposures. Research in her laboratory focuses on the mechanisms by which exposure to air pollutants such as ozone, wood smoke, cigarette smoke, and e-cigarettes modifies host defense responses using translational human, in vitro, and vivo models. Be sure to check out some of her podcasts. Today, Dr. Jaspers is going to be talking about e-cigarettes and vaping, misconceptions, health effects, and why you should care. Now I'm just going to cede the screen to her.
Okay, let's see whether this works. Okay. I think this is it. All right, let me move this over here. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for letting me be the guinea pig of this sort of virtual Teen Science Cafe. I hope this works smoothly. I can't guarantee anything, but let me know if there's anything that you can't hear because of my sort of potentially spotty Wi-Fi connection where I am in my house. Let me get started with actually the last part of this title, why I care. I care about this, as Griffin pointed out. I have my faculty appointment in pediatrics, but I'm also a mother of 2 teenagers, which actually may be listening as I'm talking here today. And this research really pertains to you guys. It really is affecting the teenagers in the United States tremendously. And this is why I care, because I have teenagers myself and I'm actually a professor in pediatrics. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with my outline here. What I want to do is actually 4 parts that I want to address today. The first part is actually clarifying some of the misconceptions that are out there in terms of the terminology and what vaping and e-cigarettes really is. Then go over into the health effects, and I'm going to go into sort of some of the evaluate and also the sort of cause and effect relationship. And then really go back to where my roots are. I have my training is in toxicology, and explain to you what the principles of toxicology are and how vaping and these vaping products really violate the principles of toxicology. And then at the very end, this is something that I literally put together up until about half an hour ago. I wanted to make this topic of vaping and e-cigarettes current. The reason why we're having this virtually is because we're all homebound because of COVID-19. And I've been getting actually quite a bit of requests on commenting on COVID-19 and vaping, and does this actually make you more susceptible? So I want to sort of give you the first glimpse of some of the data that's unpublished from our lab, and sort of give you an opinion from that's based on some of the research that we've done. So starting out with what are e-cigarettes, and I probably, in this particular audience, this is almost like a useless slide because you probably know better about this than I do. But just so, because I'm going to be referring to some of these different devices throughout my talk. This is basically like a third or fourth generation box mod with a tank. And on the bottom left is more like a vape pen, but these are basically tank devices that you refill with e-liquids. And then you have what's probably a little bit more familiar to the audience here, because it's very popular among teenagers and young adults. On the bottom is your typical Juul, and on the top is the Surin Drop. And they seem to be very, very popular among teenagers and young adults. And then you have things that really should never be part of an e-cigarette. That's not an inhaler to basically treat your asthma. That's actually what's called Puffit 2. We have one of those in our lab, and it's actually an e-cigarette. And then you also have these new devices which are using ultrasonication to actually aerosolize the e-liquid rather than heat. And so they're new devices, but then there's also a whole industry that's called vapeware. So where you basically use these sort of Fitbit-like devices that look like an e-cigarette, or you can Bluetooth your e-cigarette to your phone and receive phone calls or listen to music, or actually have a case that attaches to your iPhone that also functions as an e-cigarette. So there's lots and lots of different devices and ways to get sort of e-liquids aerosolized into your lungs. So the first misconception that I want to address is actually very, very current. And that was the flavor ban. The flavor ban was announced by the Trump administration on September 11th, after it became very clear that lots and lots of kids, teenagers, young adults were dying of e-valley or e-cigarette and vaping product associated lung injury. And so the Trump administration announced a flavor ban, which then actually was got into effect on January 2nd of 2020. And this is just a headline from the New York Times of that day, and it's basically a partial ban on e-cigarette flavors is issued. And I want to make it very clear what this actually means, or more importantly, what it does not mean. So the flavor ban basically bans all of the, strips the market of the sort of pod-based devices like Mango, Juul, or Fruit Medley, or Creme Brulee, all of these pod-based flavors. But what was exempt from it was tobacco flavored as well as menthol flavored pods. The other thing that was exempt from this flavor ban was all of these flavored e-liquids that you can use to refill your tank devices. So to be quite honest, the way I call it is actually not a flavor ban, I call it a flavor non-ban. And this is actually illustrated in this schematic here. So many of you know that Juul comes in menthol or cool mint. So what is no longer allowed is cool mint, which is the one on the left, but was further allowed to this day, even after the issue of this flavor ban, is the one on the right, which is menthol. And then on top of everything, you guys are way smarter than most people, you know, in this country. And teenagers actually found a big loophole in this new flavoring vaping ban. And this is actually direct verbiage from this particular flavor ban that I got from the FDA site. And one of the things, as you can see on the right-hand side, cartridge-based ENDS product, or electronic nicotine delivery systems, that involve cartridge or pop that holds these aerosolized products. But you see this little footnote there that basically says this number 20 here. And an example of a product that would not be captured by this definition or not captured under this ban includes completely self-contained disposable products. And by the time this actually already hit the New York Times, these disposable products became or were really, really popular among teenagers and high schools. And the Truth Initiative is a fantastic website that basically has a lot of illustrations that I use in a lot of my talks. So on the left-hand side is what's no longer allowed under this flavor ban. And on the right-hand side is what's now allowed, including the menthol, jewel, and all of these disposable products, including the very popular brand called Puffit. So one of the things that we notice in some of the clinical studies that we do when we actually recruit e-cigarette users, since 2018, most of the people we recruited were Juul users. Well, that really changed towards the end of 2019. None of our subjects in our clinical studies use Juul anymore. So we asked them, what do you use? And they basically use Puffit. Puffit is really the new kid on the block and has taken the market by storm because it comes in all of these different flavors, all of these very different snazzy little colors. And it basically is also, it's a self-contained system, contains a very, very high amount of nicotine, about 50 cigarettes per puff bar. And people are incredibly protective of these puff bars. They basically say, protect the puff bars at all costs. Having a puff bar at a party is the equivalent of pulling out a pack of gum in class. So they're extremely passionate about these puff bars. But one of the things that I really want to illustrate to you guys is that a lot of these products, we have no idea where they're coming from. We don't know anything about these disposable products. So when we looked at where this company actually is. So where is the Puff Bar headquarters? So Puff Bar is actually distributed in the United States through a company called Cool Clouds Distribution Inc. headquarters. And when you look at where that particular address is, it's here in Los Angeles, it's in California. And so what one of my former students in my lab did, he actually went to Google Maps and looked, where exactly is this, or what is the storefront of this? And this is the picture that we got. And I did it myself. So this is where Puff Bar's headquarters is this garage. So we don't know anything about these disposable products. They're coming through the gray market to the United States. We have no idea what's contained in them. We have no idea how they're being produced, where they're being produced, where they're coming from. And obviously we have absolutely no idea what their health effects are. Misconception number 2, and this is something that continues to be propagated even by my colleagues who are well-educated clinicians, basic scientists, and so on. And I try to correct them every single time I can. This was actually a misconception that was probably first introduced by the tobacco companies and by the e-cigarette companies just because of what sort of psychological connotation you have when you hear a certain word. You may have you may have sort of heard the term like e-cig vapor, or it's just a vapor cloud, or it's just water vapor versus an aerosol. Well, what is this? What is vaping, and what is actually a vapor versus an aerosol? And which term is actually more appealing? So any one of you guys who've had probably chemistry in 9th or 10th grade knows that vapor is the gaseous phase of a liquid. That's basically what the chemical and the scientific definition of vapor is. So what is it? So when we think of vapor, we think of water vapor, or we think of sort of medicinal products like Vic Vapor Rub. And we think of it actually sort of more in a positive way, or certainly less or non-harmful, non-threatening way. Whereas when we think about an aerosol, which is really the true proper definition of what you're inhaling in an e-cigarette. An aerosol is a fine solid or liquid particle, either a droplet or actually a carbonaceous particle that's in air or contained in an atmosphere with other gases. And there's actually this sort of equilibrium of gas phase component and particle phase component that is a dynamic equilibrium. And by all definitions, what you're inhaling through e-cigarettes is an aerosol. It is not a vapor. But when you think about an aerosol, you don't think of anything that's harmless. You think of something that comes out of a spray can, something that's chemical, something that's probably threatening to your health or has a toxic capacity. But that's truly what it is. And this misconception was early on introduced and further propagated, certainly by the tobacco industry. And then another sort of misconception here, smoking versus vaping. And this is another misconception even among my colleagues, where they're basically just ranking vaping as something that's in between not doing anything at all and smoking. So almost like a ranking system. But I think we have to sort of look at them as very, very different things. What smoking and vaping have in common is they're delivering nicotine to your lungs through inhalation, and they're using heat. But that's pretty much where the similarities stop. Smoking is actually the combustion of tobacco plant. We all know, though, you light the cigarette and it's a combustion, whereas vaping is actually an aerosolization of a liquid. So it's not a combustion process, it's a heating and aerosolization process, and it just changes the chemistry. Smoking really doesn't use a lot of flavoring except for menthol. Menthol cigarettes, there's a big lobby that will never get these menthol cigarettes off the market. But other than that, you're not going to have fruity pebble cigarettes. Whereas vaping and e-cigarettes come in many, many different flavors. They also have many different settings and devices. I mean, sort of, you know, there's a lot of sort of personalization that goes into vaping. Cigarettes are highly, highly regulated down to the paper of the cigarette. If you know of any toxicologist in the sort of tobacco industry, they will tell you that they have to basically regulate every single aspect of a cigarette. It's highly, highly regulated, and the quality control is really, really tight. Whereas vaping, there's few regulations, as the puff bars clearly sort of indicate to us. We have no idea where they're coming from. We have no idea what they have contained in them, and we have no idea what their health effects are. So smoking versus vaping is really comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same thing. It's not on the same scale. They're just very different things. So misconception number 3, e-cigarettes are a smoking cessation device. And this is what was originally touted. And this is where the vaping lobby and e-cigarette lobby is really, really strong. And I'm not going to say that there are not, but the data has to show me that they are a smoking cessation device. And so what's going on right now, and I need to actually update this particular slide in terms of randomized clinical trials. So a randomized clinical trial is where you basically are recruiting a certain cohort of patients. In this particular case, what they did is they recruited a group of smokers and randomized them to 3 different treatments. So smokers either got e-cigarettes or the conventional nicotine replacement therapies, like a nicotine patch or the gum or the lozenges or the nasal spray or things like that. These are the traditional nicotine replacement therapies. Or they were left alone and continued smoking. So there were these 3 different groups, and each subject enrolled in this particular study was randomized to one of them. And they followed these people for about 1 year. And after 1 year, they looked at the abstinence rate. And in the e-cig user category, 18% no longer used cigarettes. And in the nicotine replacement therapy, or NRT, the conventional patch and things like that, about 10%. So my cessation friends at UNC tell me that this is a big deal. An increase from 10% to 18% in cessation rate is a big deal. To me, it still shows that 82% of the people enrolled continued smoking, but be that as it may. But the really more important thing here is that 80% of those using e-cigarettes still use the e-cigarettes after years. So they basically were still addicted to nicotine. They did not change their nicotine or addictive behavior. They just exchanged one device for another. But what's really more alarming, and this is, again, goes to why I care, is illustrated in this particular schematic here. And these are data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey. They have surveyed e-cigarette use and cigarette use in the U.S. youth for almost 20 years now. And you can really appreciate in the green line here that the smoking rate, the current smoking rate in the U.S. has dropped significantly. I think we're now at like 5% of teenagers or high schoolers are actually smoking cigarettes. That is a huge success. And I don't want to belittle that. But at the same time, you can also see that starting in 2013, when e-cigarettes really started to get a hold of the market here, we had this really strong rise and significant rise in the use of e-cigarettes, to the point where now almost 28% of current high schoolers are using e-cigarettes. And I'm not sure how this number actually reflects reality. I'm getting sort of mixed messages that some people say, oh, in certain groups it's a lot higher than that, and in certain high schools it's probably higher than that. But it's still alarming. 28%, you know, a quarter, more than a quarter of high schoolers now being addicted to nicotine is an alarming rate. But moving now to the second part of my talk, what is really the clinical evidence for e-cigarette or vaping associated health effects? And this was really something that was a lot more difficult to explain to people until we had this outbreak of E-Valley. But there were already reports beforehand that really indicated that this was not without health effects. People have sort of shown this case of lipoid pneumonia, where it's basically a pneumonia marked by these lipid droplets in some of the cells that are in your lungs. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which is really not a disease that you see outside of a, like, let's say a farmer's lung, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. So these are all things that people, pulmonologists have seen, but not in the context of non-occupational exposures, and certainly not in young adults. We actually published a paper where we had two asthmatics, adolescent asthmatics that came to the UNC clinic, a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. And they had to basically be put on a breathing machine because they sort of had underlying asthma and went to what's called status asthmaticus, where your airways are almost filled with mucus and you can no longer breathe. And that was associated with e-cigarette use. So all of these cases were presented before we had this e-cigarette and vaping product use associated lung injury E-Valley, or this outbreak of these lung injuries last year between June and sort of October, November of 2019. And obviously everyone was trying to figure out what was the cause of E-Valley. I mean, these were otherwise really, really healthy young adults, teenagers that all of a sudden were on a ventilator, and if they came off the ventilator, had lungs that looked like those of a 70-year-old, or even needed a lung transplant. So this was something that was really, really severe. So quickly people moved to trying to identify the cause and effect relationship. What is the cause for E-Valley? And what became quickly apparent is that products containing THC, or in particularly these dank vapes, seem to be associated with E-Valley. So remember back when I talked about the puff bars, we have no idea where these puff bars are coming from. Well, we already were prepared for this sort of nebulous way of distributing puff bars, because we had already looked into dank vapes. What are dank vapes? Dank vapes are really nothing. They're really not, there is no dank vape headquarters anywhere, you know, in the United States. They're really nothing. They're basically just these packaging materials that you can order online. As a matter of fact, we have those in my lab. So you basically get these cartridges that you can then fill with whatever you want, and then put them into these packages and then sell them as dank vapes. And people sort of do these with THC. The packages actually come pre-printed and tell you all kinds of things that have no relationship to what's actually in your cartridge. They say something like it's 92% THC, but I could fill this with blue Gatorade and basically put it into that packaging, and the package would still say it's 92% THC. So these dank vapes are really, it's not a company, it's nothing at all. They basically were filled in bootlegged sort of production lines where people use THC and then basically cut the THC to make more money. And this is really where the sort of detective work came to a conclusion. In November of 2019, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, released data on 29 lung fluid samples from E-Valley patients, of which actually 2 had already died. And all of these samples contained vitamin E acetate, whereas samples from non-E-Valley patients, none of them contained it. And THC was present in 23 of the 28 samples and nicotine in 16. So basically, what was common to all of the samples that they had found from these evaluated patients was the vitamin E acetate. What is it? What is vitamin E acetate? Well, this is the chemical structure, if anybody is interested, but we have all used vitamin E acetate in one way or another. We're actually being told to eat it as part of our nutrition. Avocados, almonds are very rich in vitamin E, in forms of vitamin E acetate. We use it in cosmetic products. We use it as a dietary supplement. So vitamin E acetate is actually really helpful and is sort of touted as an antioxidant. So why are we concerned about it? And so this is where I think my background as a toxicologist comes in, because I do think it completely violates the principles of toxicology. This is actually a slide that I use in my introductory lecture in biochemical and molecular toxicology. I teach at UNC. And it basically provides a historical context of what toxicology is all about. And we consider Paracelsus as the grandfather of toxicology. And what he basically said was that all substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. Or for short, the dose makes the poison. And this is really the guiding principle in toxicology. And you all know that things like water can be a toxicant. Oxygen is good at normal levels, but obviously can be a toxicant at high doses. Same with salt. You can basically make an argument for any substance or any compound that you know that at the right or at the wrong dose, it becomes a poison. But in the context of e-cigarette and vaping components, I would propose to actually expand this principle and say, does the route of exposure make the poison? Why do I think that? When we, in the context of toxicology, in which sort of assesses how, you know, either consumer products or pharmaceutical agents or environmental contaminants can affect human health, we usually think of three different routes of exposure. We think of ingestion through food or oral drugs, inhalation, or skin absorption or skin contact. So those are the three major routes of exposure. And in the context of vitamin E, you know, ingestion is perfectly safe. Absorption through skin contact is perfectly safe. But now all of a sudden you're changing it to the inhalation route, and that's when you get into trouble. So you're changing it by just purely changing the route of exposure, you're changing the potential for the toxicity. And we also think the same is true for flavoring agents. We know that flavoring agents are used in food, they're actually used in cosmetic products, but do you change the route of inhalation to the route of inhalation, do you actually change the toxicity? And we know an example for that. So when you inhale flavoring agents at a level that's really, really high, can you cause lung injury? And there is an example out there already using diacetyl. Diacetyl is a buttery flavor. It makes butter taste like butter. It's contained in butter, and it's actually contained in many, many other products to give that sort of buttery taste. So some of the flavored coffees, for example, coffee creamers, or popcorn, buttery popcorn contains a lot of diacetyl. So in the late 1990s to early 2000s, what happened was popcorn or factory workers in these popcorn factories came down with a disease that mimics what you would get from a rejected lung transplant, a disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. It's a non-reversible fibrosis or stiffening of your lung. It's a terrible disease. And these people were otherwise perfectly healthy, never had a lung transplant, but came down with a disease that you would only usually get in people with a rejected lung transplant. And so what this disease is now called, actually is called popcorn lung, because it came down it was first detected in these workers from these popcorn factories. But in November of 2019, we actually started seeing this in real life outside of these popcorn factories. In Canada, there was a teenager that actually developed this sort of pathology, the lung pathology, that looked exactly like popcorn lung, like vaping illness. And it was not the same as an evaluate patient. So it looked very, very different. But this was basically now an example that in addition to E-Valley, these inhalation of these high doses of flavoring agents can actually cause really, really bad diseases in the lung. Oops, what did I do here? Okay. But we're also interested in other flavoring that are contained in e-liquids. And this is just a selection of a few: cinnamaldehyde, benzaldehyde, vanillin, ethyl vanillin. And one of the reasons why we are interested in these is, you can probably guess, they all look chemically very similarly. These are all aromatic aldehydes. If you remember possibly from your chemistry lecture, aromatic meaning it has this sort of ring structure, and an aldehyde, it has that sort of double bond O aldehydic group here. And all of them have these kinds of features in their chemical structure. Why do we care about this? And as an inhalation toxicologist, we know that inhaled aldehydes are a bad actor. We know that from many other aldehydes that have known toxicity when they're inhaled. So we were really interested in these different flavoring agents. And one of the things, or among the things that we've done in my lab, is really look at respiratory host defense. We're looking at how things like the mucociliary escalator, which is illustrated in this movie here, is possibly modified by these different flavoring agents. And the mucociliary escalators basically is trapping bacteria and viruses on the sort of mucus layer, and then it's being propelled up to the larynx, pharynx, and is swallowed. The other thing that's part of this respiratory host defense are macrophages and neutrophils. These are the sort of like the immune cells that are patrolling your lung, and they basically are the guard dogs outside of your fence. And what we've shown is just sort of summarized in some of these articles here. E-cigarettes, and particularly flavorings, have significant effects on these different aspects of respiratory host defense. But one thing that basically is just a quick summary of all of this research is that e-cigarettes really cause an overall suppression of key host defense functions in the respiratory tract, and really cause immune dysfunction that likely will put the respiratory tract at an increased susceptibility to any kind of pathogenic infection, both bacterial and viral infection. But how toxic are really these e-cig flavors? I told you about cinnamaldehyde. We actually spend quite a bit of work and effort on understanding the toxicity of this one flavoring agent. But how toxic really are they? And you may recognize them. This is Griffin and Nathan. They actually came to visit my lab and saw basically firsthand how these e-cigarette flavors are toxic firsthand. The young woman with the pipette in their hand is Dr. Megan Rabuli. She's an assistant professor in my lab. And in the background is Dr. Philip Clapp. He was a graduate student, is now hopefully going to be moving into assistant professor position very soon. So what Griffin and Nathan were able to see is we basically just took some of these e-liquids and added them to a regular tissue culture dish. And this is basically, we had two different e-liquids with and without nicotine. The one with nicotine is on the top left. The one without is right next to it. Then one with very little cinnamaldehyde, and then on the bottom right, we have pure cinnamaldehyde. And this is sort of illustrated in this particular graph right here. This is basically the outline of our experiment. And we just let it sit and washed it off the next morning, and this is what we saw. So what you can see here is this sort of opaque-like feature on the plastic. And Nathan actually has these plates now in his possession. And basically what it shows is that these e-liquids are very, very aggressive, and they basically cause almost corrosion of the plastic in these in this particular tissue culture plate. So these chemicals are highly, highly aggressive to the point where they corrode plastic at a very high level, even liquefied plastic. So or thinking that they are without health effects in your lungs is, I think, very naive. So the next couple of slides, and this is how I'm going to finish off, is what is next? And obviously, as we're all sort of like on this Zoom meeting here, we're all quarantined at home, which is why we cannot be at the Morehead Planetarium. And so I wanted to put some of the research that we have done into the context of COVID-19 and susceptibility to respiratory viral infections. And there's, I think, again, it goes back to the sort of first thing that I talked about, some of the misconceptions. And I want to clarify something here. And I actually have an email that I need to answer from a reporter addressing some of this. And this is actually what really sort of shocked me early on. And on March 10th, Mayor de Blasio from New York City, the New York City mayor, talked about this 22-year-old man who otherwise was very healthy. And as you all know, COVID-19 seems to be striking mostly the older people, certainly not a 22-year-old, unless this 22-year-old had an underlying condition. And this particular 22-year-old had nothing as an underlying condition, no immune compromise, no underlying respiratory disease, no underlying cardiovascular disease. The only factor that they knew could be a potential susceptibility factor was he was a very, very strong vapor. So we don't know of any pre-existing conditions, but we do think the fact that he is a vapor is affecting the situation. This was on March 10th. Move forward 9 days later. Sean Hannity from Fox News, who is an avid vapor, a very pro-vaping proponent, basically vaping all the time in between sets, actually suggested that vaping would prevent people from getting coronavirus, that using e-cigarettes and vaping could protect you against COVID-19. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, you'll realize that this is not true. And this came out yesterday in Scientific American. And this was actually one of my colleagues at UNC commented that smokers, we already know that smokers are more susceptible to respiratory viral infections. And some of the risk factors that cause smokers to be more susceptible are also present at vaping. So what do we know? And so here are some of the things that we're hopefully going to be, my lab is hopefully going to be contributing to this field. So we actually have some unpublished data that shows that e-cigarettes do affect viral infection. This goes back to what I showed you earlier on. All of the research that we've shown is that e-cigarettes and vaping causes an immune dysfunction in your respiratory tract and immune suppression. So what we did is we used a model that we've used for almost 20 years now in my lab, where we used the quadrivalent flu mist vaccine. Some of you may have actually gotten this when you were little as an influenza virus vaccine. What is this? Flu mist is actually a life attenuated influenza virus. It's an LAIV. And what is this? So it is live. So you actually are getting infected with a small dose of a live virus, and it replicates like normal influenza in your nasal mucosa, but it is much attenuated. So it does not give you any of the symptoms you would normally have with the flu. It is also cold adapted, so it can only replicate in your nose and cannot get to the lower airways. So it's much, much milder, and it's really limited to the nose, which is actually perfect because you can mount an immune response without actually getting the sort of symptoms you would normally get with influenza. And we've exploited that sort of feature of this sort of flu mist vaccine for several years to use flu mist as a safe way to study viral infections in humans in vivo. And this is exactly what we did here. So we recruited 3 different groups, 3 different cohorts. We recruited otherwise healthy non-smokers, healthy smokers, and healthy e-cigarette users. And we made sure that they were who they were by basically asking them to have a vaping and smoking diary. We then inoculated them with a flu mist vaccine, and we actually took a number of different samples from their nose. We took what is this sort of like the strip-like feature that you see on the bottom here, and that basically just samples your nasal mucosa and provides a really good way and super non-invasive way to sample sort of soluble markers and soluble mediators in your nose. We also took some superficial scrape biopsies of your nasal mucosa, which we analyzed for RNA and markers of immune gene expression. And so this is what we found. When we compared the gene expression of what we found in e-cigarette users and cigarette smokers and compared them to sort of like the baseline, which is our non-smokers. First of all, you can see from this Venn diagram, the genes that we found changed in cigarette smokers and those in e-cigarette users are quite different. There's 52 genes that seem to be changing in the same direction in both cigarette smokers and e-cigarette users, but there are a lot more things going on in e-cigarette users than there are in cigarette smokers. And the vast majority of these genes that are suppressed in e-cigarette users, you can see on the bottom, 160 of them were decreased, really regulated immune function. And with particular focus on immune functions that regulate antibody production. As you know, when you get vaccines, one of the goals for this is to actually generate antibodies so you're protected against a real infection. So what we did is we actually took samples from the nasal mucosa and looked for a particular antibody that is specific for LAIV. And what we found was that in e-cigarette users, we actually saw a decreased level of these LAIV specific antibodies. So in addition to changing a number of genes that are regulating immune responses in your nasal mucosa, in your respiratory tract, e-cigarette users were also compromised in their ability to actually form antibodies that are protective for a subsequent infection. So putting this into where we are today in COVID-19 land, which is where, where we all are, in addition to potentially actually changing the whole sort of symptomology of what you get with COVID-19 in these vapors, another thing that we need to consider is that vaping may actually affect the ability of mounting an antibody response and actually generating a protective long-term memory response in these e-cigarette users. So before I open up for questions, I need to actually acknowledge all of the people in my lab that have done this work. In particular, this is my lab over here. In particular, I want to thank Elise Hickman and Alexia Perriman and Giles Escobar, who've been really great contributors, as well as Megan Rabuli, lots of the funding. And with that, I'm going to open up for questions.
If I may go ahead and pose a question, Dr. Jaspers.
Sure.
In the experiment where you showed us how the vaping liquid had kind of destroyed the plastic container, how concentrated is the aerosol people are actually inhaling versus what you put in those dishes?
So the aerosol is, and that's an excellent question, Griffin. So we looked at, to some extent, at the concentration of the cinnamaldehyde in the aerosol versus the liquid, and that doesn't seem to change. So it really is more how much of it actually gets into your lungs. So as you remember, when we did the experiment in my lab, we just put a drop of it into the tissue culture dish. And that's probably, I'm guessing it's about 200 microliters maybe. A tank that's in one of these tank devices is about 3 mils. So quite a bit more than what we added to the tissue culture dish. And people go through at least sometimes multiple tanks a day. So obviously the lungs have a great surface area, but it's not unreasonable to speculate that some of those droplets and some of those aerosols would coat your airways to a similar extent to what we saw on the plastic.
Sweet, thank you.
We've got a question from the audience, and that is, how does smoking as a risk factor compare to the other risk factors such as cardiovascular disease or obesity?
So sometimes, first of all, sometimes smoking comes with actually cardiovascular disease and obesity. They often are not, they sort of coexist. Certainly smoking can cause cardiovascular disease. and obesity can cause cardiovascular. So I mean, it's sort of like this vicious circle. They all sort of like play together. Is this question in the context of does smoking, cardiovascular disease, obesity in the context of susceptibility to COVID-19?
Yeah, it says specifically COVID risk factors.
Yeah. We are so early on in all of this COVID research. I would recommend to wait a couple of months to see once we sort of get better data. There's obviously data coming out of China where the smoking rate is pretty high, but the obesity rate is low. So, you know, I don't know. And then the data coming out of Europe might have different sort of characteristics as well. So I think we need to wait a little bit longer until we can say whether and to what extent these behavior or susceptibility factors increase COVID-19.
So we've got another question. This one's from a fellow teen advisory board member. And the question is, if someone is going to smoke regardless, which would be less damaging for them to smoke in the long term, cigarettes or e-cigs? Is the answer the same for the short term?
So I get this question all the time. And I have not changed my answer. You know, it's basically, I think it's going to be different things. So if you, for example, smoke cigarettes, you have a great likelihood of developing what we know are smoking related diseases, such as bronchitis, COPD, potentially cancers. We know that. What you will develop from e-cigarettes long-term, we don't know. So is it safer? I don't know, because I don't know what will be caused if you are an avid e-cig user or an avid vapor, what kind of health effects you will have 20 years from now. It took us decades to link smoking to cancer and to COPD and to some of these other smoking related diseases. E-cigarettes have only been really popular on the US market for, let's say, 8 years, maybe less than that. So we don't really have a whole generation that has been chronically using e-cigarettes for, you know, 1, 2, 3 decades. So I've sort of avoided that question, not avoided that question, but really sort of answered that question with a non-answer, just because I don't think we have the answer.
Okay, I've got another question for you here. Do you or your lab know what causes the increase in gene expression changes in e-cigarette users as compared to normal cigarette users?
That is a fascinating question. So we are trying to figure that out with a sort of reductionist approach. That's an excellent question. So one way to do this is by looking at the individual components. So we looked at the different flavors. That's one thing. Giles Escobar in my lab is actually looking at the vehicle components, the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin that gives this sort of really nice cloud. So she's looking into that. And then I have another person in my lab who's looking actually into the different nicotine forms, because the nicotine that you have in your cigarette is a different form than what you have now in these newer e-cigarettes. So we're just basically taking what is contained in e-cigarettes apart and one by one try to understand whether that is what's mimicking the sort of suppression of genes in we see in the e-cig users. It's an excellent question and we're working on it.
We got another question, and it is, what do you think are the biggest challenges for addressing the misconceptions about which you talked about earlier? Probably more.
Nathan, that's a great question. And so I think the biggest challenge is, like, within my own community, among scientists, I can certainly correct them every time they use vapor versus aerosol. I can take care of that. Or people like myself who've been classically trained in this sort of field. But the other misconceptions really need to go out in the general public. So I would love for, you know, anyone who's participated in this to sort of take these misconceptions and tell them it's not a vapor, it's an aerosol. The flavor ban actually doesn't ban flavors, it just bans very, very little. So I'm trying to sort of get the message out to other people who can help me spread the message even further. Among the scientific community, among the sort of scientists, I can do that, but that's a bubble. So people like everyone on this sort of Zoom meeting, you guys need to know this, and you guys need to propagate that there are current misconceptions out there. So I'm basically answering the question by telling whoever asked that question, go out and tell everyone about these misconceptions.
All right, we got one more here. So does your lab have any current plans for spreading these finds to the general public in the near future? From what I understand, the advice would be to at least avoid flavored e-cigarettes.
Yes. So Elise Hickman in my lab has actually developed a K through 12 lesson plan that we're hoping to implement actually in local high schools. We have done a sort of a toolkit that we're trying to take to different high schools and middle schools across the state. We would love to get more involved into the high school teaching and actually using real science to get this into these concepts into the high schools. And then a new sort of project I may take on is one of the things that's seemed to be really helpful is this concept of peer ambassadors. You know, teenagers are not going to listen to me necessarily because I'm sort of like a teacher and or a parent. So you're going to roll your eyes when I tell you this is bad. But ambassadors, peer ambassadors that are not quite as far removed from teenagers may actually be able to convey this message. And so I'm looking into actually recruiting maybe college athletes to help me spread this message to teenagers across the state of North Carolina.
All right, well, I have one question. So because this event is part of the NC Science Festival, and this year's theme is the future, I'm curious about kind of what you're most excited about in the future of your field of study. We won't necessarily ask you to make predictions because that's putting you on the spot, but yeah.
So what am I most excited about this? So I've been a scientist, you know, at UNC for over 20 years. I've studied air pollution probably for 25 years. I did my dissertation in that field. And what's been frustrating to me a little bit is that the research and the findings and the observations I get in my lab really don't have any meaning or change anything. I mean, some of the things that we actually did sort of changed air pollution standards. That was one thing. But the future, what I think is most exciting about this research is that the research we actually do in the lab can actually change behavior much faster than waiting for, you know, regulatory standards to be implemented. So what I'm excited about in terms of the future is that the research we're doing and the findings and the observations and, you know, the sort of health effects we're uncovering, linking e-cigarette aerosols and components of that to potential health effects would actually be translated into action. And that's what I'm actually most excited about.
All right, well, thank you. And we have time for maybe one more question if anybody has any more.
There are two up on the question and answer board, so we got to pick which one. Or we could do both.
Yeah, we could do two. If they're up there, we might as well.
All right, I'll go ahead and read the first one.
Great.
So it's, do non-flavored e-cigarettes cause similar additional respiratory distress to that produced by the flavored e-cigarettes that you talked about in your presentation, or is that only caused by the e-cigs with flavoring?
So that's an excellent question, and that will actually be the PhD dissertation of my student Jael Escobar. So she has actually found that the sort of laboratory-based e-cigarette liquids without any flavorings have their own unique health effects. And she's actually working on some of the sort of different nicotine concentrations and nicotine forms. You may have heard about nicotine salts. So she's looking into that, as well as just the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin. So to answer the question, they do have effects, but they're probably different from the flavors. So whether they all add up to each other when they're all in a mixture, that's something that we're trying to understand. But the flavors, even e-liquids without flavors, to have health effects.
And I think the last question comes from Shaw. And it is, since more information about the Puff Bar has come out, have they become less popular?
To be quite honest, I don't know whether the information that I have been able to acquire has actually reached the customer. So, so I don't know whether Puff Bars are less popular now than they were, let's say, in January. I have not been to any of the local vape shops in a while, but the last time I was there, they were super popular. Juul was basically moved to the back of the store because no one was going to buy them anymore, and Puff Bars were basically dominating the shelves. So that was, to be quite honest, because we're all quarantined, I haven't been out in a while, so I don't know where that actually stands now. But I would think they're still popular, unless something has changed because we're all quarantined. So I'm curious to see when we're all emerging outside of our houses, what's going on in the sort of e-cig industry and user behavior.
All right, and we do have time for one more question. So since it's, do you know of any current campaigns to pass additional legal bars or bans on flavored e-cigarettes or other types of vapes?
So I know that I have written actually or co-signed letters to the FDA. As you may know, the FDA just had a change in leadership not too long ago, so that always delays things. I don't know whether there is any taste in the current Congress for taking up any more challenges to this flavor ban, and it sort of moved into the background with everything else going on right now. Nobody really cares about e-cigarettes and flavors anymore because there's plenty of other things that sort of are grabbing our attention. So to answer your question, I don't know of anything else legally going on. The last thing that we did was something in February where we signed a letter to the FDA basically saying that these flavor bans are basically flavor non-bans. So we just wanted to be on record I think this was actually in the context of the American Thoracic Society, which is a large the largest association of pulmonologists in the United States. So we actually did that in that context. So to answer your question, I don't know whether there's anything else going on. I doubt that there's much energy to take this up at the current moment.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Jaspers. We really appreciate you joining us today, especially being the first one of the virtual Teen Science Cafe that will continue until June 11th. So a couple action items for people to kind of take on as they finish out the school year. Address these misconceptions about vaping to all of your friends. 2, spread the word about the virtual Teen Science Cafe and that we will be meeting every Thursday, 5 p.m. And keep an eye out for those emails about with the speaker roster. So yeah, thanks again for everybody who tuned in.